All right, hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your boy, your favorite conservatarian contrarian, Jeff Charles. Got another fire conversation for you tonight. It's going to be great. And I'm going to do a do-over on that.
Okay.
I forgot something. Okay. Hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your boy, Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. I've got another fire conversation for you tonight, another fresh perspective for you. But before we get into all that, you know what you got to do. You got to like this video, you got to share this video, and you got to subscribe to my podcast, to my YouTube channel, all of it. Hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. That way you will be notified whenever I upload a new interview, which happens every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern. Also, you got to remember that LibertyNation.com is a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. Check out LibertyNation.com for all of your conservatarian news, original articles, analysis, videos, podcasts, Liberty Nation Radio, and their signature TV program, The Conservative Five, all on LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback. So I have another very special guest for you guys today. Like I said, we're going to talk about individual rights. We're going to talk about cancel culture, all kinds of cool stuff. You know, it's been in the news over the past few years. We've been dealing with it. So I'm very much looking forward to talking to Mr. Terry Pell, president of the Center for Individual Rights. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Good. I'm glad to have you on. I'm looking forward to learning more about what you guys are doing and all that good stuff. So why don't we start out just by having you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your organization, what you do?
Well, the Center for Individual Rights has been working for over the last 30 years to restore a traditional conception of individual rights, to enforce individual rights, to strengthen them and strengthen the legal precedents that support individual rights, particularly in the area of free speech. That's been a concern of our organization from the beginning. And as you mentioned in your intro, that is very much a difficult topic right now because as political debate has become more heated, both sides have tried to essentially deal with that problem by silencing the other side. And so we are getting calls almost weekly from people who have been fired from their job, people who have been punished, people who have been restricted from participating in, government and sponsored websites simply and solely because they expressed an unpopular view. And in many of these cases, the Constitution does not permit that, and we will go to court to defend individuals whose right to free speech has been infringed upon in some way.
Okay. So let me ask you, so how long have you guys been around, the Center for Individual Rights?
Since 1989.
1989. Okay, so let me ask you this. I mean, if you're focused mainly on the First Amendment, I mean, going back to 1989, I mean, were you dealing with a lot of the stuff that you're dealing with now, or maybe like in a different format, or would you say it's gotten worse for the past 2 years, or how has this progressed since you guys have been in action?
Well, when we started, we had a few high-profile cases involving, for example, professors who were accused of sexual harassment, really as a pretext to silence a politically unpopular view that they perhaps talked about in class. And we maybe got one or two of those cases, every year. In the last year, we have brought 4 cases, all focusing on some aspect of free speech in the workplace. And the really significant difference now is that this is going on in private workplaces, government workplaces. It's no longer isolated or focused on the college campuses. For years, college campuses were the focus of free speech disputes. And more recently, though, in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, political censorship has become a mainstream American issue. And a good reason for that is that it's entered the workplace. Now, as it turns out, employees can be fired for expressing almost any view that an outside political activist later decides is controversial. So that's the big change. I mean, it's one thing if you're a college student and or even a college professor, and you say something unpopular and you're investigated by the speech police at your university. It's quite a different thing if you go to work and are fired for something you said, say, in an off-work podcast that somebody decides to weaponize in order to make you the villain and get you fired, and so that you lose your job, your health insurance, and all the rest of it. That's quite a bit more of a serious issue involving individual rights, and it's where we become most active in the last couple of years.
Yeah, so that's weird to me, because I actually just kind of last year, but you're right. Anytime that there was a debate over free speech, especially if I'm writing about it or whether I'm reading about it, it was always on a college campus. Like, that's where we always think that these battles take place, because historically that's where they've been. I mean, going back to the days of Berkeley, when it was people on the left who were fighting for free speech, all the way up until now, where, like you said, if you're a professor who has an unpopular point of view, especially if you're on the right, you might get targeted. But it has entered the workplace. Have you heard of an organization called Counterweight?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I don't think it's that popular. They were just formed late last year, and I wrote about it, and that's how I learned that this has entered the workplace, because it's basically a support group for people who are either being targeted at their work or who have already been fired for their political beliefs. So when we think of like cancel culture, we usually think of like celebrities, politicians, or people who get the social media mob. But I mean, when it's on that level, it's bad, but it's not quite as dangerous. But what people don't know, and I want you to kind of expand on this, it is affecting regular, everyday people. Can you give us a little bit of insight into how that's happening?
Well, essentially, outside activists, mostly on the left, have decided to politicize the workplace. And what they've done is tried to use the workplace as a lever to enforce political conformity. And you're exactly right. It's one thing if you're a political figure or a public person and you enter a public debate. You kind of go into it with your eyes open, and you know that there's going to be some back and forth. You might get attacked, but you've decided to enter a public debate. It's quite another thing if you go to work one day and your boss calls you in about something you said on your Facebook, a couple of years ago, that somebody outside the company has decided to make an issue out of. And that's what's happening more and more often. The fact is, nobody knows what they can say anymore, and suddenly they're in the crosshairs. And unfortunately, the employers are unwilling to stand up to these pressure tactics. Very often, an activist will engage people on Twitter to attack an employer, and employers are very skittish about, Twitter mobs coming after them and destroying their reputation. So their first knee-jerk reaction is to just dump the poor employee overboard, just fire him that day, so that they can hopefully, avoid the Twitter mob and put the problem behind them. And, that's sort of a cheap solution to the problem, because it invites more and more of this, essentially what it is a bullying or terroristic activity where people who, have a very extreme political view are ganging up on employers and forcing them to adopt extreme speech codes for their workers. And the workers are, blindsided by this. It's a new political reality. They can't possibly protect themselves against things they might have said several years ago on social media. And so the result is they know that they can be fired for anything they might have said. And it's a very unhealthy environment. And that, I think we do need support groups for this. But more than that, we need employees to understand that there are laws that prevent this, and that these laws need to be enforced. And when this happens, we need to go to court to defend these employees. And that's what our organization is doing as fast as we can.
So let me ask you this. I mean, if it's like a certain type of business, do these attacks usually come from within the company, or are you seeing that they mostly come from outside the company? Like maybe they'll see somebody say something, look up where they work, and then go after the company, or is it about equal? Or
I would say it's 50-50. I mean, we have one case where a university professor published an article in a peer-reviewed medical journal, and the topic of the article was the difficulty of achieving diversity in the medical profession. And the article criticized the overuse of racial preferences in medical schools. It said this is a problem that's inhibiting diversity. It's not helping diversity. Well, that's a controversial view. And this triggered a Twitter mob that went after the school using the hashtag #MedRacism. And within 2 weeks, the professor was demoted and forbidden from seeing students over the expression of a completely, reasoned view that was backed up, in a journal article with statistics. And I mean, this was a very objective, analytical article. There was nothing incendiary about it at all. He was punished purely for expressing this point of view. And this whole effort was stage managed by a group of Twitter activists who just came after the school. So that's one type of example. Another type of example is we were representing a vice president in a private corporation who had permission to have an off-work podcast, which he did on the weekends. It focused on craft beers and had some political discussion kind of interspersed with, reviews of, beers. And it was all very informal. And he'd been doing this for several years. The employer said, fine, it's your off-work time. You can do whatever you want. And in this case, another employee found the YouTube channel with all the podcasts and went through 200 of them and found a couple of them where our client had said something that this employee disagreed with. So he wrote a letter and sent an email to the entire company without talking to our client and said, it's 2022, this man needs to be fired immediately. And within a day, the vice president of the company fired him, despite the assurances he'd been given that this was his off-work speech. So this is an example of somebody in the company weaponizing speech in order to get rid of an employee that he didn't like for some reason. It was just totally, kind of an internal vendetta of some kind, I guess. I think what's the problem here is that since people understand employers are vulnerable and they'll cave so quickly, everybody across the board, whether it's Twitter or co-workers, anybody can weaponize speech now to punish people for views that are even slightly out of the mainstream, no matter how reasoned they are. So that's just a terrific problem that we really need to stand up to.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole different world, I would imagine, from when you guys were operating in the 90s and stuff like that. Because you're right. I mean, if I'm working at a company and I decide I don't like somebody, I can find their social media. I can dig through it. I can watch all 200 of their videos to find something that they may have said that could be construed as offensive or controversial and use that to get people fired. And I'll give you the counterpoint to this, because I know what people on the left will say. Oh, that's not going to happen that often, or their views are reprehensible anyway. This isn't going to become a common thing. But I'm seeing the slippery slope there. So what would you say to somebody who says, this isn't going to become more of a thing? It's okay. It's fine. Like, it's not a big deal. It's not happening often enough to where we need to be worried about it.
That is not certainly our experience. We're getting calls every other week. People are utterly blindsided by this. They're amazed when it happens to them. Their first instinct is to crawl under a rock, which is, of course, exactly the wrong response. And but some people say, well, people should know better. They should know, to avoid certain topics, and they should understand that, there are certain sensitivities now that maybe didn't exist a couple of years ago. And, in a way that's fair, but in a way it's a problem because people have been on social media for a decade now, and they've expressed their views on all kinds of things. And basically anything you say on social media can be taken out of context and used against you. And now it's sort of the perception of controversy that matters more than any actual controversy. If somebody stands up and says, I'm offended and this is controversial, the employer just throws up his hands and says, oh, yes, this must be controversial, without thinking about what's actually happening here. And so, it's sort of the problem is escalating very quickly because people now realize there's no check on this and nobody's standing up to it.
Yeah, and I think that's the crux of the matter. These companies give in. I mean, I remember, I think it was last year, or the year before, I saw a story about a guy who was pushing back against, CRT or some other issues in his school district, and then this local group targeted him. And I will admit that he said some things that I probably wouldn't have said, but he worked for, I believe it was American Airlines, and they tagged American Airlines in on Twitter. And I want to say they got him fired because of what he had said. So this is a real thing. So here's my question. I mean, because you mentioned that it's not legal to do this, but I know that the law says that, say, if I'm working at an employer, they can't fire me because I'm Black or because I'm a Christian or whatever. There are clear laws in the Constitution against that. But what laws are there regarding speech? I mean,
That's a very good question.
Should they be able to fire me if I say something that hurts their company? Or
no, that's a very good point. The First Amendment does not cover private employment. So, and private employers, traditionally, employers and employees have sort of understood, that certain things are off limits. You can't, for example, attack your employer's product. Right. Everybody understands that. And so, in the normal flow of things, employers and employees generally agree and understand what's appropriate. What we're concerned with is not that, but where an outside activist uses strong-arm tactics to disrupt those kind of common sense understandings of what you can say and not say, and tries to inject a political agenda into the workplace where certain topics become off limits, even though they have nothing to do with the workplace, nothing to do with the employer. It's just somebody who has an axe to grind and is leaning on the employer to try to get the employer to enforce a speech code that the employer probably doesn't care about either, except the fact that they don't want to be caught in the crosshairs. So that's where we step in. But yes, no, you're totally right. Employers have a reasonable interest in regulating speech, on work speech, and even sometimes off work speech. Yeah. And people understand that, and they, these rules have kind of worked out over time, and they're reasonable rules, and people can catch on to how they work. They're not blindsided by them. It's, there's usually discussions in the workplace, and what's off limits and what isn't, and everything is fine, more or less. So, but what we've got now is a new situation where outsiders jump on something you say and use it solely as a way to punish certain points of view so that they can't be expressed either on work or off work. And that's a real problem. Some jurisdictions, right now, about half the jurisdictions or half the workplaces in America are covered by some type of law that protects employee speech. Okay. If you work for the government cannot punish employees for speech based totally on the point of view of the speech. Right. So if you happen to express a political view, the government can't fire you for that, especially if it's in your off work time. And there are a number of laws that also cover private employers. For example, you mentioned it's illegal in every jurisdiction to discriminate against employees based on race or religion. Well, it's also illegal in some jurisdictions to discriminate against employees based on their political views. Okay. And that's a good law. Right here in Howard County, right outside Washington, D.C., it's illegal to discriminate based on political view, which kind of makes sense because in the D.C. area, people have a lot of political views. So essentially, Howard County says, employers cannot get into the business of picking and choosing based on the political views of their employees. That's a good law, and it ought to be expanded in other jurisdictions. The idea here is to allow employers to sensibly regulate speech having to do with actual employment issues, but not allow employers to start discriminating against employees based solely on the expression of, say, an out of favor political view.
So let me throw a hypothetical at you, because this is actually something I've been thinking about for a long time. Especially when it concerns this issue. And because there's also, because I would say, what about freedom of association? I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So let's say I own a company and it's got like 50, 100 employees or whatever. And then somebody on Twitter says, hey, Jeff, Greg Stewart over here basically came out. He was in Charlottesville talking about how he hates Black people. He wants to ship you all back to Africa and whatever. I don't want to sort of say with that guy, I probably want to fire him. Would I be okay doing that, or would I be violating a law? Or how would that play out as far as where you and I come from, where we value free speech?
Well, that's a good question. I think an employer who the best way for an employer to deal with that situation is bring the two employees together and get them to talk to each other. Because a lot of times you hear that so-and-so said something in Charlottesville or somewhere else,
Right.
and it gets amplified and confused. And so the starting point ought to get the employees and the employer to just kind of work this kind of issue out together. Maybe the employee who said something in Charlottesville, was misquoted. Or maybe the employee who said something in Charlottesville has second thoughts. And maybe a conversation between the two employees would kind of bring that out, and it would be something that could be worked out on a kind of case-by-case basis. But I do agree there are certain situations where employees say something that is so off the charts and incendiary that it makes it impossible for them to be in the workplace. And I think the law allows latitude for employers to take account of that. It's just, that's the rare case. That's not the common case.
Sure. Yeah.
The common case is it's a misunderstanding. It's based on some type of misunderstanding. And before the employers just haul off and fire somebody, it's at least worth a conversation between the offended employee and the employee who said something to just try to understand each other. That's what a sensible look. If we're going to have a diverse workforce with people of different races, different religions, and different political beliefs, we've got to figure out a way to work out these kind of issues without firing people wholesale who happen to express an unpopular view. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it can't be worked out. Sometimes the employer has to take steps, but that should be the rare case, not the common case.
Yeah, and I would think that even as far as from a morale issue, that's going to harm company morale if you have somebody who actually is saying something like that. It could also harm the company. So, there are other arguments to be made in that regard as well. So this whole cancel culture in the workplace, that's what this is, cancel culture in the workplace.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I know you guys you do litigation, but really overall, how are you going to counter this problem? Because like you said before, the problem isn't so much people on the outside making a big deal out of what people are saying. It's the fact that the companies let themselves be bullied. And sometimes I've seen it happen to where, somebody will complain and they have like 10 followers and then the company will still give into them. Yeah. It's ridiculous. So how do you stop this, or what should we be doing about this?
Well, listen, employers are very sensitive to potential litigation. And so what I think we need to do is enforce the law here in a handful of high-profile cases. And once we do that, we give employers an incentive to at least look at both sides of these types of issues before they reflexively fire the guy who says something controversial or the woman who says something controversial. It's so I think litigation plays a role here. I think the law, it definitely creates an incentive, a framework for employers and employees to kind of work these things out, because it's in the interest, it's certainly of the employer and likely of the employee too, to avoid litigation. But the key here is we got to enforce the laws we have, which is what we're trying to do. And I think employees have to understand that when this happens to them, they're not alone. There are laws that protect them, and there are organizations like mine that will defend them, and they have to stand up for themselves. And if they do that, it's like any type of bully situation. If you stand up to the bully, you can make a lot of headway very quickly. And if you don't do that, conversely, you're asking for a heap of trouble down the road. So an employer, is really doing something very risky here to let, a lone employee start weaponizing speech in the workplace. I think most employers are committed to having a diverse workforce, and that means learning to get employees. It basically means restoring the traditional idea of the workplace, which is employees are there to work together to get a job done, regardless of their coworkers' off-work, religious views, political views, their off-work speech. The employer's position ought to be, we're here to get a job done. And that means we have to tolerate people who have different off-work religions and political beliefs. That's just not part of the workplace. And that's a sensible approach here. And what the activists are trying to do is bring these off-work speech disputes into the workplace and then use the employer as a club to go after one side of these speech disputes. And that's not right. That's going to tear the workplace apart. It's going to make it a very unpleasant place for people to be, because they have no idea what they can say. And so I think employers, once they've had some experience with this and maybe read about a few hopefully successful lawsuits, will open their eyes to possibly more creative solutions to this problem than to just haul off and fire somebody.
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing a really big siloing effect when it comes to our industries. I mean, you see certain companies taking a stand and alienating half of their customer base. You're seeing people create companies that are catered to political affiliation. I mean, like even with that whole trucker convoy in Canada, I mean, the GoFundMe, that the crowdfunding industry was becoming siloed because they wouldn't allow people to donate to them, but then Give, Send, Go, another crowdfunding company, would. This will even create more of a siloing effect. If you're a conservative, you can't work at this company. If you're a leftist, you can't work at this company, or what have you. So I think people don't realize how dangerous this is. And I like that. And I'll say, I like that you're using litigation, because really companies are acting out of fear, and they need to fear doing the wrong thing more than, the right thing. I don't like that it's necessary, though. I don't like that it's necessary that you even have to do this. But in this case, companies do need to see the consequences will be worse if you just haul off and fire people because they say something that some of your other employees don't like, or some outside person doesn't like. Now, as far as these laws goes that you mentioned, I just want to clarify: are these federal laws, or do they just tend to be more localized? Or
well, the First Amendment is a federal law, and it applies to all governments, federal and state. The private employment laws, though, are generally state or local, or state and local. And really what we're talking about are non-discrimination laws. Every state and every locality has non-discrimination laws based on race. Many of them have laws based on religion. And what we need is to expand these laws to include political point of view as well. That would provide protection for every private employment, every private workplace, and that would be a good thing. And I think, we're starting to see some movement and some awareness. I think the cancel culture types, the activists had a success early on getting employers to fire people, and they sort of set a pattern and an expectation that now employers feel like they all have to adopt that template. But that's not true. And as you mentioned, there are legal costs to that. And once employers become aware of what those costs are, there'll be some back pressure here, and we'll sort of restore some balance. But sometimes it does take litigation. There's no doubt about it.
So the issue is that if you happen to work for a company and it's in an area or a state where they don't have laws that prohibit discrimination based on political affiliation, that's an issue. So what do you see as a solution as far as legislatively? Do you think that the federal government should pass a discrimination law, or do you think this should be handled by states, or what would be the most effective in your estimation?
Well, I think it's a little unlikely that the federal government would pass a law like this. It's just the government, the Congress is too divided. So I think it probably makes sense for states and localities to do this, because states have different approaches and they have different, pre-existing legal frameworks. Some states, Connecticut, for example, has basically extended the federal First Amendment to the private workplace in their state. So that's another way of doing it. So, I think we should be open to different approaches here by different states and different localities. The main idea is to understand that this is a problem and it needs to be addressed. Employees need some type of legal recourse so they're not out on their ear based on a completely unfair mischaracterization of their off-work speech. That's just not right.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's like if you take social media out of the equation, if I'm at some get-together and some other people are there and I say something they don't like, they shouldn't be able to call my company and say, hey, I was at a party with this guy and he said he wanted to tighten up stuff at the border. So that means he likes the great replacement theory. They shouldn't be able to do that. And this should work that way with social media too. So is there a way to find out, and maybe you might have this resource already, like which states do have laws or in which states don't have laws that deal with political discrimination?
Well, we do not have a list. I wish we did. We're working on it. But it's, as I said, it just varies so much from state to state. And some of these are, county level employment discrimination laws. So it's I mean, I think people who face this type of situation should contact an organization or contact an attorney. And it's usually fairly easy to determine, in a fairly quick way, whether there's a law that applies or not. So, I mean, it's not a mystery, but it's hard to put it together for the whole country.
So where should, because I mean, I honestly, it's not being talked about enough right now, in my opinion. This issue needs to be, I think it's going to become more of an explosive issue as time goes on and they're getting away with this stuff. Where can people go to find out more about what's happening with this whole cancel culture in the workplace?
Well, they can come to our website, and there are other organizations like ours that are litigating these cases as well. So a little bit of work on the internet can get you a lot of information about this. I would say that we're at the beginning stages, though. We are, we've got 4 cases going on right now. We'll have another couple in the pipeline, but it takes a while to get these cases up and running and to publicize them. And so, there's a lot of work to be done. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I do think it's very unfortunate that individuals who face this right now kind of feel lost and alone, and they just kind of want to, as I said, crawl under a rock. And that's exactly the wrong response. So that's why we need to try to connect with these people and encourage them to connect with us so that we can stand up to this, as a society and not just let this kind of steamroller people.
I agree. So I know we're coming up on time, but last question. I know you don't really represent businesses, you do more individuals, but when it comes to free speech, I got to know, what did you think of the whole Ron DeSantis and Disney thing as far as taking away their tax status because of the parental rights and education bill? Was that the right move, or did he overstep?
Listen, I think in that case, Disney was acting like it was a company without a state, that was free to do whatever it wanted. And the fact is, these companies are very dependent upon special carve-outs and special laws that benefit them. And the state of Florida has a right to expect that its citizens are going to be treated fairly. And when a company, just blatantly goes after a view shared by half the state, it's very reasonable for a governor to say, well, okay, wait a minute here. We're going to relook at the special arrangements that we've created, for you. And I think that was a good lesson. I think a lot of other companies saw that. And I think if these types of situations arise in the future, people within the corporation now have some leverage to bring up to upper management and say, if you do this, look what happened to Disney. You maybe want to rethink this. So I think that's the type of back pressure we need here to just try to get things back in a balanced state of affairs.
Gotcha. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you joining me. But before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Sure. Our web address is www.cir-usa.org. So cir-usa.org. Or you can just put Center for Individual Rights in the browser and you'll come right to our website.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to have to do this again sometime because this issue isn't going away. And like you said, you're just getting revved up. This is going to be like a long-term battle. So I want to talk about this again because there's going to be other issues that come up. But in the meantime, I really appreciate you joining my program.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.